I'm Susan Sutton, assistant curator here at the Menil collection. I'm also the curator for the exhibition that we'll be discussing this evening, A Thin Wall of Air, Charles James, which opened today and will be on view through September 7th. I would like to welcome you this evening to our panel discussion revolving around the exhibition to discuss James himself, where I am joined by three special guests, each of whom brings with them a particular perspective on Charles James. Tonight we will explore James as a designer, an artist, and his unique and rich relationship to the Menils. I am joined by Harold Koda. He is curator in charge of the Costume Institute at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, where he's just opened Charles James Beyond Fashion, which is on view through August 10th. And if you have an opportunity to visit New York this summer, there's an extraordinary and spectacular exhibition which takes a retrospective view of James. We're also joined this evening by creative consultant for Chanel in Paris, Lady Amanda Harlech. And she has been named to the International Best Dressed Hall of Fame, amongst many of her accomplishments. We're also joined this evening by former fashion features director for Harper's Bazaar and Paris bureau chief for Fairchild Publications, William Middleton. He's also the author of the forthcoming biography of Dominique and John de Menil. In organizing this panel this evening, I would like to thank Carl Killian, our Director of Public Programs. Thank you, Carl. And Tony Martinez, our Program Manager. And I would like to extend a continued thanks to my colleagues in curatorial, Brooke Stroud, Toby Camps, Michelle White, Claire Elliott, Art Services, Tom Walsh and his team, and my colleagues who've also joined with me to help make this exhibition possible, Tay Smith and Lisa Sakaris. So with that, I'd like to give you a bit of an overview of James, a quick introduction to the designer, and a little bit about the exhibition to get us situated, and then we'll begin the discussion, and hopefully we'll have some time for some audience Q&A at the end. Charles James, 1906 to 1978, is considered by many to be America's first couturier. Starting out as a milliner, by the 1940s, he had established himself as a premier fashion designer with an elite clientele that included Millicent Rogers and Gloria Swanson. John and Dominique de Menil were introduced to James during that decade, and Dominique de Menil began to buy pieces from him soon thereafter. As the relationship deepened, the couple became great champions of James, commissioning both furniture and couture, collecting his sketches, donating examples of his works to museums, which predominantly was the Brooklyn Museum, which now the Costume Institute houses and cares for, and hiring him to dress their interior of their home, his only residential commission. A Thin Wall of Air explores the work of the designer in relation to two of these most committed patrons and clients. So as a couturier, James was known for his virtuosic design and construction, and his dramatic silhouettes and daring color combinations. For James, one of the possibilities of design lay not, or one of the true possibilities of design lay not in the, not necessarily in the body or the fabric, but also in between the body and the fabric, and what he conceived of as a wall of air, and what the exhibition describes as a thin wall of air, per Bill Cunningham's description. After the completion of their Philip Johnson designed home in River Oaks neighborhood in 1950, John and Dominique de Menil hired James to dress their interior. James' style was the very inverse of Johnson's minimal, sparse modernity. Dominique explained, "We could see right away how we would get bored, and John, who was always full of extraordinary creative ideas, a spirit of enterprise, dangerous ideas, thought of inviting Charles James." He introduced felt and velvet walls in butterscotch and fuchsia. He hand-mixed paints in mauve, aqua, and gray with a patina, to show as if they were aged by time. And he also created custom furniture, installing sweeping curves in an otherwise completely rectilinear home. As in his fashion designs, the juxtapositions are often have a surreal undertone, which dovetail with the Menils' own artistic interest and sensibilities. Further, James' intervention in the Menil home results in a multitude of rich tensions as it plays out within the structures of international modernism. And this is something that we've tried to capture in the exhibition. With this overview and background in place, I think we can begin our discussion. And as I said earlier, if we have time, we'll open it up to Q&A in the last 15 minutes or so.
Susan, is that the clicker?
That is the clicker.
Thank you. Click it to the right. There you go. So this is forward?
Yes. All right. So let's see, where's my microphone? All right, so my first question this evening is going to be for Harold. As he's just launched this amazing retrospective of James. And so Harold, what has the Costume Institute retrospective uncovered about Charles James? How would you characterize his importance as a fashion designer?
Amongst fashion professionals, James has always had, he's sort of like the designer's designer. He's a secret reference point for many, many designers who like architectural shapes. When we began to consider an exhibition of his work, I wasn't convinced he was all that great. And it's because the things that I saw were in such states of disrepair. One of the things about James is he takes a very muscular approach to design, and so he forces fabric into these contortions that sometimes they don't want to take. So they leave the workroom in an absolute state of perfection. But over time, physics takes its toll, and that's what I was seeing. So I would say that our intention with the exhibition was to allow not only the fashion professional who would see the intrinsic worth of this designer, but also the general public to somehow have access to an understanding of why he is so distinctive. One of the things that occurred to me was, and this is a photograph of him in the 1920s, is that James, like so many of the surrealists that Susan alluded to, was born in the pre-World War I period. And so he was born in the late Edwardian, a child of privilege. His mother was a very wealthy Chicago socialite. And, but his adulthood occurred during and after the First World War, this transformative moment. And we all know about the heady 20s, the roaring 20s, but it's Lady Caroline Lamb's description of Lord Byron that I think most aptly applies to people like James and his friends, including Stephen Tennant, a famous British aesthete who was important in terms of his early clientele, and Cecil Beaton. Caroline Lamb said Lord Byron was mad, bad, and dangerous to know. And there was this aspect of this group that because of their circumstances of privilege and because of the complete chaos that the First World War had brought on society, the transformative role it had, they were estranged from any kind of proprieties that you or I might have. It was the kind of approach that only the really rich, I think, could indulge. And someone like Millicent Rogers, the Standard Oil heiress, became one of his early clients. And it's the clothes that we see that Dominique de Menil, Millicent Rogers, Austin Hearst wore in the post-war period, post-World War II, that come to characterize what we think of as James. These very romantic, sumptuous, very luxurious ball gowns, which we have in spades in the exhibition. I mean, this is what everyone thinks of as James. When you look at them, however, what you see is, in fact, the kind of fantasy of the pre-war period. It's the 1880s and 1890s, and that is when many of the surrealists were born. The palette that he uses is very, very strange in terms of a contemporary taste, this kind of chestnut brown. Years ago, when I went to visit a donor whose wife had died, Lisa Kirk, he was showing me all of her Halstons, and we took a lot. And then as we were leaving the apartment, my assistant and he stopped us and said, "Would you like to see some Charles James?" And we said, "My God, you have Jameses?" So he had his super, he was in an apartment building, bring them up from the basement. There were 5 of them. And they were in these big sheets, bed sheets, with these huge safety pins. And my assistant, Ellen, sat on the floor, and then she was undoing them. There were these huge things. They were the size, really, of this podium. And when she took the last safety pin out, the skirt popped open. And she burst into tears. Ellen literally burst into tears, and she said, "I've never seen anything so beautiful." And what it was she was suddenly immersed in this torrent of pink, cream, purple, lavender tulle that just all under the brown. It's that kind of obsession with detail, which of course undermined my own attitude that he's not such a great designer. He did, when Susan talks about a wall of air, yes, a medical idea of what a garment should do. But in fact, the client, as he said, came into his atelier with her body and left with his. And you can see one of the models that is preparing for a défilé trying to shimmy herself into this gown, which really has its own structure. It's really pure architecture. He's famous, of course, for being incredibly inventive, and he really is. The taxi dress from the late 1920s, we have a version from 1932-33, was designed with the idea that unlike a 20 chemise, which you had to step into or pull over your head, that the modern woman should be able to undress very easily, even in the back of a cab. While he was drying himself at the beach, he pulled a towel between his legs and he thought, my God, this could be a skirt. And so you have this kind of three-dimensional understanding, again, in the 30s. In the 1930s also, there were other designers who were investigating the idea of a strapless dress, but he was very early on this. This is from 1938, where he is distinctive. If you think about movies in the 1930s, there's a kind of romantic revival of the 1850s, the Empress Eugenie period, with the heavy crinolines, but because it's the 30s, they've taken all the crinolines out. So there's kind of languorous, very fatigued beauty, a very sort of ennui-ridden beauty. James refers to that, but he puts all this understructure in. So he anticipates the post-war new look, which Dior says was inspired by James, because not just simply because he reintroduces the corset, but he begins to do structured things that happen below the waist. He is also regarded as the first person to do a down jacket. Also in 1938, it's a one-of, it's at the Victoria and Albert. Whether or not there were puffer jackets before, there actually were, but they were bed jackets. And what he's done is he's made the transit from the intimacy of your dressing room to an evening out. The one funny thing about this particular jacket is that when he had it, it was his prototype, he had everyone wear it, including their photographs of a Hispanic motorcyclist, Juan Ramos, everybody, Pat Cleveland, the model. He lent it to a lot of people. It's surprising that it still survives. He was someone who looked at history, and here he's looking at the Empire period. This was donated to the Brooklyn Museum by Austin Hirsch. She purchased it for him. He did the toile, a line-for-line copy, and then he created a bra that actually lifted and separated the breast rather than created this sort of platonic cone shape that was prevalent in the 50s. I'm going to end with this slide, which is as close to the wall of air as you get. He was, as Poirier said, probably a better designer because he started a milliner, because he really did have no respect for the fabric. What he would do is he would steam it, he would pull it, he would twist it. He really would manhandle the fabric to submit to his will. And when you see the slide, and the image in the very middle, he's just stuffed tissue under what's going to be a jacket. So he has the form of the woman, but he inserts this other space in a very, very muscular and vigorous manner.
So is there actually anything in the exhibition, in the Menil exhibition, that sort of speaks to that design sensibility about maybe this wall of air that...
The tailoring more, actually, than the evening clothes.
Yeah.
But, you know, to have the wall of air, you'd have a puddle of cloth at your feet, right, if it wasn't supported somewhere. So with the tailoring, there is some support by the shoulders, but he was one of the designers who liked to use the hip line as a point where all of the weight was poised. I actually do have this image, which is of his masterwork, the cloverleaf dress. We had a replica made, a line-for-line replica made by a theatrical costume builder, and she found the right crinoline. I mean, there are more than 5 different layers. It's actually 4 primary layers, but each layer has multiple plies on it. And the model Electra Wiedemann wore it, and she said, it weighs 10 pounds. And she said, you know, it really is not uncomfortable to wear, because what it does is, of course, the bodice is supported by boning, so it's lifted up. But the skirt, all of this weight, most of the 10 pounds, is actually displaced around the hips, but not in a conventional way. If you think about a conventional garment in a conventional mannequin, there's a straight line. They just sort of cut a straight line as if there's a waistline that goes straight across your midriff. And James said that's not how the anatomy works. It's 2 curves that go over the hip bones. And so by balancing this dress over the hip bones, Electra found it very, very comfortable to wear. She said it'd be impossible really to negotiate a dining room because there's just so much fabric. It's almost 8 feet at the far points. But she said, but it would be really nice to dance in. He saw it as a waltzing dress because the man could just slip into the valley of the front. Valley of the...
So another, I think, layer to this idea of a wall of air is the idea of proximity. So the proximity of relationships. And I'd like to ask William, what have you learned about the relationship between the de Menils and Charles James?
Well, let's try to get my little thing up. I have researched quite a bit of the early history of Dominique and Jean de Menil. In fact, I have a friend who tells me that if I spend any more time in the early years, that we're going to have to call the book The Dawn of the de Menils. But this was Dominique de Menil in 1930, and this was Jean de Menil in the 1930s, a little later. Dominique was someone who came from a very grand Protestant family named the Schlumberger family. And her father was someone who had tremendous style, her mother as well. Style was not something that was particularly important for her. She tended, you know, she was certainly elegant, but she tended to have things made at the local tailor. She tended to buy patterns and have them made at the tailor. Jean de Menil, on the other hand, who came from a Catholic family that had been a very grand family and fell onto tough times around the time he was born, was someone for whom style was very important. When he first started working, and he started working at a bank when he was about 17, and when he first started making money, one of the first things he did was he had his shirts custom made at Lanvin. And his mother was horrified you know, because they'd gone through about 15 or 20 years of really difficult times by that point. And Jean de Menil, you know, one of the first things he does is spend money on fashion. So style was really important for him. And I want to give you just a little sense of kind of the aesthetic development of Dominique and Jean de Menil. And it begins here in a funny little place called Kolbsheim, which is in Alsace. It's a chateau, 18th century, on the top of a hill that looks out over the Vosges Mountains, and it has 25 acres of grounds that are French gardens that give way to English gardens. It's a lovely place. It's owned by her cousin, Antoinette Schlumberger-Grunilus, and it was actually owned by the Grunilus family. But what is interesting about it for our story today is that in 1930, they hired someone named Pierre Barbe, who's a Paris architect who was very much a modernist, worked with Le Corbusier, was part of a group of early modernists in Paris, and they hired him to redesign the interior of the chateau. And what he did that was interesting, it had been subdivided in the 19th century, rooms had been broken down, it had been broken down in smaller rooms to be able to heat easily, and he took out all of those partitions and he restored it to its sort of original sense of grandeur, and he gave it a kind of machine age modernism, while still respecting the past. This is a very dark image of the library, but you see this Vosges stones. It looks out over the Vosges Mountains, this house, and this is a staircase out of Vosges stones with an aluminum banister and a little sconce in alabaster. So this, when the de Menils saw this in 1930, the year they met, they decided to hire Pierre Barbe, and he redid their apartment in Paris. This is where they live. This was their house in Paris. This is where Dominique de Menil grew up. And as soon as she and Jean de Menil were married in 1931, their parents gave them the floor above their apartment. And they did something interesting. They hired Barbe, and these apartments, it's a 19th century Louis Philippe building, and they're filled with kind of ceiling moldings and ornate decoration all around, and Pierre Barbe stripped all of that out and introduced new elements like this sofa that you see here, the low bookfa that you see here, the low book on the small table he designed as well. This is how it looks now. But again, and introducing these sort of machine age elements, but there's a respect for the past as well. So what I think is interesting, and I could show you other interiors that Pierre Barbe did for the de Menils. He actually became a sort of the house architect for the Schlumberger family. He did their country house outside of Paris. He did the Schlumberger, or their rooms in the Schlumberger chateau in Normandy. And he did quite a few interiors for other members of her family. But this is just to give you a sense of, yes? And the de Menils apartment in Paris on the right. And I feel that there's just there's a consistency here. There's a stripped down sort of modernism with a respect for the past. So all that to say that the de Menils had some sort of context, you know, there was a stylistic context before they arrived in Houston and built this house. And they hired Philip Johnson to do it, and it's Philip Johnson at his most sort of Miesian. And this is what he was doing at the time, as many of you know. This was his glass house that he was also building at the same time he was working on the de Menils. And this was the interior that Philip Johnson had in mind for the glass house. And as Susan was mentioning, Dominique said, you know, we realized that it wouldn't be very adventurous. Philip felt that we should have a Mies van der Rohe settee, a Mies van der Rohe square glass table, and two Mies van der Rohe chairs on a little square musty colored rug, which is exactly what we have there. We could see right away how we could get bored, and John, who was always full of extraordinary creative ideas, dangerous ideas, thought of inviting Charles James. Philip Johnson, of course, was furious. He wrote a letter that expressed his disappointment. And Charles James, of course, loved that. And Dominique has a very funny take on that. She says, so Charles James, who had a side that was very perverse, he loved the perversion of taste, and he had ideas that were actually, in their originality, considered perverse because they went against the grain, against what was mainstream, but were often very remarkable. So he was thrilled. He had fun teasing Philip Johnson. Now we're going to do a Turkish patio. It's going to be very Middle Eastern. She said, Charles always loved curves, beautiful curves, and this was a time when Philip Johnson was completely under the sway of Mies van der Rohe, for whom there was only the straight line and the straight angle. Anything else was considered heresy. The slightest curve for Philip Johnson at the time was considered heretical, which is amusing considering how much he used the curve himself in his later career, but at that time it was heretical. So this is what the interior of the de Menil house looks like after the intervention of Charles James. And what she said is Charles James came here very quickly. He saw little that there were some great elements that shouldn't be touched, the brick walls, etc. But he had some simple ideas that were excellent, making the colors in the hallways very rich, places that are usually quite boring, hallways, closets, using very interesting, exciting colors, and leaving the large rooms very sober. But he came up with ideas like this 18th century Venetian sofa covered in this vivid fabric. He designed this lip sofa, the dressing room, the dining room, banquette, and the hallways. So what is interesting is that from, as you had said, I believe, that they began in 1947. She began dressing in Charles James in 1947 because of John de Menil. He's the one who wanted her to wear his designs. And she, from the beginning, it seems to me, saw him as an artist. One of the things that she said about his work is he was such a perfectionist when it came to beauty that he would have redone a dress 10 times in a row rather than permit a small flaw somewhere that didn't work well. But he started making a few dresses for me, and suddenly I ended up with many dresses, coats, and suits by him. And I swear it wasn't any more expensive than if they had been made from Chanel in Paris. Amanda.
Not true.
That's true.
He was someone who had the potential to lead you astray, but he was passionately interesting. So the de Menils started treating James. Well, Charles James was interested in having his work in the collection of museums, and he began with the Brooklyn Museum. And the de Menils very quickly became two of his larger supporters. And in a June 1957 letter to the Brooklyn Museum, Dominique said, "My husband and I consider Charles James to be the most original and universal designers of this period and in this country. It has long been the desire of Charles James to give the entire record of his life work to the Brooklyn Museum." And they gave, at that point, a $10,000 contribution to purchase works from James. So what they did is they gave the Brooklyn Museum funds, and the Brooklyn Museum used those funds to acquire the pieces from James. So the pieces that the Brooklyn Museum has, which are considerable, were never worn by Dominique de Menil. They were acquired specifically for the museum. And there are 69 works that the de Menils gave to the Brooklyn Museum, 28 garments, 5 evening dresses, including these 2, 7 skirts, 2 coats, 1 suit, 1 day dress, and 10 pieces of baby wear, even. There are also 41 process-related objects, including patterns, petticoats,
Flayed baby.
What's that?
The baby mannequin is made at the birth of his, made Charles the Younger. He's not junior, he's younger. And it has the real anatomy of a baby, a flat butt, a big belly. And then he sprayed it with this velour, but it's this blood red, like the baby's flayed. It's just a strange. Well, I should mention the thing about the baby coat, though. The arc of the coat is related to a 19th century dolman, a little jacket that women wore, but he's changed the arc of the arms because he felt that babies, when they were lying down, would splay their arms open, which he thought was really ungainly, and that they should have a much more embracing, ambitious, loving pose. And so he made it so the child had to be. So that's why those sleeves.
That's funny. In one of the letters that's at the Brooklyn Museum, when Dominique de Menil gives the funds to purchase the baby clothes, she suggests that the idea for him to do baby clothes came from Christian Dior. Which I haven't seen that information anywhere else. But
we don't have it in any of his records.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, it's only from her that I've seen that, but she does say it very clearly. Yeah, so just to conclude very quickly here, in a 1958 letter to the Brooklyn Museum, Dominique de Menil said, "We share with the museum the belief that Charles James will one day be recognized as the outstanding genius in fashion of our time. I've followed his works closely. I've watched the stream of ideas that constantly flows out of his amazingly creative mind and eventually oozes throughout the fashion world. Someday that story will be written."
So thank you, William. And my next question is for Lady Amanda Harlech. You have worked very closely with two great designers, John Galliano and Karl Lagerfeld. It has been said that Charles James is a designer's designer. What does that mean to you?
That means breaking rules. I think both John and Karl, when they're the sort of flame, or if the genesis of a collection is about creating, in Karl's case, a new silhouette, and in John's case, it was often re-engineering something like a sleeve or a skirt. And the designer's designer, I don't know, really. That's the answer. I mean, a designer, other designers, I suppose one that springs to mind is Vivienne Westwood, bizarrely. It's not necessarily that popular, but it's because of that complete obsession with exploring shape, seam, construction, engineering, and those are the things which certainly, fire up both Karl and John.
So a real dedication to that, just an immersion in material and construction.
I think always the thing is, you can't change the shape of a woman entirely, but you can impose a new silhouette that maybe they will love.
And that was very much what James was about, was imposing that.
Yeah, that's why, for me, the fascination with James is very much where I want to wear these clothes. I want to try out what it feels like. What is that dynamic? Because there is something so sensuous about the fabric, the rough with the smooth, the color, all of those things, but actually this idea that the weight would be distributed in such a way that it would allow movement. And this is where, somebody like Karl is very, very committed and fascinated by the idea of silhouette and movement, of lightness, and John, the idea that clothes should be like wearing a second skin. The idea of having a layer of air between you and the dynamic of the clothes is fascinating. So sort of looking at everything and inside things. So when I came in December and saw the things on the tables before, the exhibition, when it was just becoming, it was extraordinary to see the interior work, to be able to see the construction on the inside that allowed this outside. And I think that's another thing that, a designer would be fascinated in.
Right, and so we have actually images here that Amanda took when she was here on her visit. What really inspired you about, or what spoke to you when you first saw these pieces?
Well, it was a response that was very visceral. It was about color and it was about texture. I love the idea of rough and smooth. I think that was something that was very strong with John. And the idea of putting like canvas or felt with a noble fabric like silk fire or something, or silk velvet, is fascinating, or the delicacy of a rough organza with something that has a super smooth sheen. those things, that's like music. It has a whole kind of polyphonic side, which is sort of brings the clothes to life, so that they're not just a flat surface, that they've also got these other rhythms and things inside them. So, and then when you have the cutting and the darts and the whole musical side of it, or to use a sort of synesthesia really, the clothes were completely engaging and absorbing in a multi-dimensional way. I mean, I really wanted to try them on. Of course, I couldn't get anywhere near them.
It's interesting, Amanda, that you're using the metaphor of music, because
music.
he was a prodigy as a pianist.
That's what I feel. I can hear it in the clothes. It's like counterpoint and then also Stockhausen.
And also it's something that's moving over time. So there's nothing static. It's something. I mean, when you follow his seam lines, they're not anything predictive. There's something that have a cadence, and then they get congested,
or
and then they
jar.
open up.
It's a dissonance, and then a resolution.
Lots of dissonance.
Yeah. So you have seams that are absolutely at really odd angles, which make sense as an overall shape, but it has its internal melody.
And then you also see these repetitions where he plays out a similar a seam,
like a fugue or these little.
And he'll invert it, revert it.
One of the things that you might not notice when you go through the exhibition is that there are things that he was certainly capable of doing something symmetrical. He preferred asymmetry. Here he has a client. You know that he has a custom mannequin for her. And when you look at the way he has his center closings, they're all off. He never wants it to be... So he had the confidence, and really Dominique had the confidence, to wear something where it looked like it should be just pulled over slightly. Look at it. It's very subtle. It's a subtle, disruptive thing that he does about symmetry.
But that's that thing. There is that strange. There is no beauty without strangeness.
Yes.
And I think the idea that if there's difficulty, the complexity gives it its vitality and makes it new. And I think that's really interesting about Charles James.
Yeah, we definitely experienced that when we were dressing the clothes, that we would want to tug at things, and we asked ourselves, is this off? Why is this? Yeah. But it was also a really interesting exploration of the human body, and realizing that the idiosyncratic features of one person's body, and how one changes over time, and having to accommodate for that, and dressing and thinking through, is this Dominique de Menil or is this James? Where is that coming into play there? So I thought actually we might kind of discuss a little bit too about the house. I know all three of you, William has spent quite a bit of time at the house studying it and thinking about it, but today was actually Harold's first time at the house, and I was interested in getting a sort of your reaction to James's intervention in the Johnson house, and how you see that relates to his fashion design.
James was a designer who was very engaged by contemporary art in his life, and so a lot of people have made references to his association with the Surrealists. And when you look at his biomorphic shapes, you definitely see things that you see in a Max Ernst sculpture or a Tanguy landscape. He's in that kind of vocabulary. However, going to the house, there's also an insertion of a certain amount of orthogonal colored planes that intersect. And so Susan and I were saying, this, looking at the interior of this closet, it's more like Russian constructivism, but that also is part of his avant-gardist exposure in the 1920s. And for me, the part that astonished me was that it's the 1950s, 40s and 50s with the New York School that I see as, it's my co-curator who really loves the Surrealist association, but I see especially in his palette, and you see it more in the house, they're not pure colors. There are a few primary colors. There's blue and there's yellow, but it's not a clear blue. There's a thing that dirties it a little, and the yellow is saturated, but there's maybe a little bit of orange in it. They're very odd colors, and most of them are secondary or tertiary colors, and they're mostly color mixes. And you know, when you look at the dressing room with the way the cabinets, and they're, all of those colors play with each other. It's not just two colors, it's two colors, it's three. He's very much doing a kind of composition with colors that...
Like a painter.
That you see in his clothes. And there's this one shot that Amanda has taken of the detail of the yellow damask coat, and then you see a little bit of the ice blue lining. There's a room that's that. It's a dirtier yellow, but and we're describing it as ochre, but it really is a yellow, and it has ice blue carpeting.
And so William, from your perspective, what do you think are some of the most important intervention aspects that James created in the house?
Well, we all think of the furniture, you know, the pieces that he designed, which are certainly significant, and the colors. But I think one of the elements that's overlooked is the historical furniture that he brought, the 18th century Venetian sofa, the Belter furniture, you know, all things that would have horrified Philip Johnson at that time. You know, I think that the Belter furniture was something that Dominique de Menil felt very strongly about, you know, and you see why James would respond to it. He was a violin maker, Belter, and the furniture is layers and layers of wood that are much like violins. And
and their silhouette is like a James body.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it is.
Absolutely.
We were talking, in fact, when we were going through the house. I didn't realize this, but none of the de Menils played the piano. But
I wondered that.
But he insisted on the piano, and I said, well, it makes sense because he's in this very orthogonal space. Everything is right-angled. When you look at the piano, you can't tell from this, but when you look at its profile, there is a right angle by the keyboard to the back, and then it introduces this very sensual curve that's then picked up like a leitmotif throughout all of the bathrooms. So you know, he's used the piano to segue between contemporary modernism, the rigors of the straight line and the right angle, to the more sensual curvature of the romantic pre-World War I, fin de siècle, Belle Époque, Edwardian era.
And so, Amanda, and what has impressed upon you about the house? How has it struck you?
I think the thing that impressed me the most was the jungle in the glass house with the green of the sofa in front of it, and the contrast between something that's has this sensuous line and the rigor of the house. One of the questions you sent me in via email, which put me into a major panic, was let's talk about the literary aesthetic and Charles James and Dominique de Menil. But the question did flag up something, because Charles James sent her, amongst many books, but two books in particular, which was the Walter Pater, Gaston Latour, and the biography of Oscar Wilde. Well, actually, the house holds exactly that conflict and opposition. Pater criticized Wilde, whose idea of beauty was something carnal and profane, and Pater's thing was much more that there's a virtue and a spirituality. And within that, you have actually that contrast, that rich kind of energy of conflicting things within the house, which is what I felt, with something that's something which is almost hedonistic, like the jungle, or the curves, the kind of
the Protestant,
seductive. And
the Protestant married a Catholic.
Exactly. So that's what I took from it.
Just looking at the atrium, it reminds me of one piece of information that Dominique mentioned in an interview, is that Philip Johnson wanted, even in the atrium, he wanted just one tree with grass below it. And she said that it's impossible to grow grass below a tree or it becomes really expensive, and she wasn't going to do that. And so once she put all these tropical plants into it, all she had to do was cut it once a year and it was fine.
I did love the great big crucifix in the kitchen and in the bedroom. I mean, that's...
Do we have a... I don't know if we have an image of that.
And
Let's see
also
here.
inside the cupboards, which is the thing about the inside of the clothes. I thought that was...
Right, and so here we have an image of the hallway with doors that are covered on one side with velvet and the other side with felt. And so you have these, reversals or alterations, but also it plays into movement. So you open a door and then something else emerges.
Like the skirt coming out.
And what James did in that last image of the multi-layered gown, in the cloverleaf, there are 3 segments. There is a satin bodice and upper skirt, a velvet band, a biomorphic velvet band, which he called conflicting sine curves, and then a hem that's in a ivory file. All of those things are abutting; they're not appliqued, and so he's had to engineer it. He's had to balance the grain, and it's a really beautifully realized dress. But the fact that he would care that the hem in the identical color as the upper skirt and the bodice should have a different tonality, that it should sort of drift away in a kind of matte haze, that suggests the kind of thing that he's doing in the house. Though he reverses it. He has the sensual surface. It's like skinning a cat. You have the fur, flaying a cat. You have the fur, and then you go in, and then there's a shiny surface.
And so I actually want to turn my next question to back to.
Has he done that?
Well, so I think, this sort of vivacious, it's almost like a torrent in his designing. It's sometimes it just sort of feels like a mishmash in a way. And I think, Harold, you've even said that when you get into the underside of a garment, it's sort of Frankensteinian in a way. And I think that's maybe where your initial hesitation to...
Yeah, someone like Carl really cares about craft. And I remember sitting with him when we were preparing for an exhibition, and he was so excited, and he had one of the assistants bring in a swatch, and he said, hold it. And it was a very airily woven wool, but you didn't feel it in your hand. And that would never be James. James liked the materiality of things, and even though he claimed to care about technique, he did perhaps 200, 250 original designs over his 50 years. He worked like an artist, and I don't want to be an armchair psychoanalyst, but when he became a milliner, it was as much to mortify his father as it was to find something to do. Because he could have been a great painter. He studied painting. He could have been a sculptor. He cared about three-dimensional form. But he chose to be a milliner. It was one way of saying, I'm doing something that is very fey and live with it. And so he's working as an artist in a field that he didn't necessarily have to end up in. It's an interesting element in terms of his own psychology. There's always this kind of ambivalence about his relationship to fashion. We say at the Met show that he was an artist working in the medium of fashion, because he was not a fashion designer. And there are brilliant fashion designers who belong in art museums, and we would argue Carl and John are two of them, but they don't work as artists. No. And Carl would never say he's an artist, even though he's done masterworks. He would never say he's an artist. He sees himself as a designer. And it's a very different kind of way of relating to the active creation of something aesthetic.
Right.
I'm working class, isn't that what he says?
Carl always says, I'm of no class, just working class. But also there's the thing of art and craft. Right. And also the industry, which are things that are very important to Carl.
So William, given sort of this allusion to James's psychology, and that he was notorious for having a combative personality, and was sort of had troubled relationships throughout his life. It's quite remarkable that the Menils were maintained such a loyalty to him, really till the very end. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I think we have to say that Charles James could be a bit of a monster. I think that he's someone who had a pretty strong personality, and I've heard stories of there was a yes, we've heard quite a few stories of his monstrousness. I won't get into too many, but I've also seen some correspondence from John de Menil where he sort of suggested in the 1960s that they had to start to get it under control with James, because they were giving money to the Brooklyn Museum, and then he wanted some of the pieces to go to Chicago, and Jean de Menil said, that's fine if they go to Chicago, but I don't want Charlie to think that we're going to be buying them again for the Brooklyn Museum. He's got to learn that no is no, And so I see that there was some, desire to control and some understanding that maybe he could be a little complicated. But then Dominique de Menil said something that I think was really interesting. She was talking about the idea of doing an exhibition of his work, and she said, I'd like to do an exhibition of his dresses, his furniture, and at the same time give a sense of his character, especially his character. His life was very complicated, but it's his character. He was so combative, very neurotic, but it was a kind of neuroticism that he tapped into that drove his design. It's not that simple. He needed confirmation, opposition, in order to give the best of himself. So I think that that's an important part, because part of me feels that, gosh, wouldn't it be great if Charles James had someone like a Pierre Berger or a large company like LVMH that could support him or something like that. But no, that wasn't what he was about. He was an artist.
There are several people who actually knew him as relatively young people who interned with him. And the one aspect that doesn't come across in most of the anecdotes that are repeated is that he was an incredibly generous mentor. And so if you were someone who wanted to learn about design, or even was just having a hard patch in your relationship with your parents, he was somebody who would come in and give you advice. He would tell you what plays to go to, what film to see, what music to listen to. He was very generous in terms of that. Not necessarily with his own children, but with these people who were coming into his studio. And I really will shut up with this one anecdote. There was, at the end of the Brooklyn Museum exhibition in 1982, at the big gala dinner, there were still a few gowns in that period, 1982, that belonged to private people. So they were allowed to be worn by these young models to walk down the runway as a sort of heady moment, a climax of the evening. And the curator, Elizabeth Coleman, who was actually the curator at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, asked this one young girl, she was 16 years old, and she was one of the few people who was small enough to fit into one of these gowns. She said, I'll never wear a James gown. What does it feel like? And this 16-year-old, this teenager said, well, it's telling me how to stand, and it's teaching me how to walk. It's a lesson in beauty. And one of the things that we wanted to do with the exhibition is somehow communicate that aspect of his work, that all of this was directed because of the generosity of people like the de Menils, of Millicent Rogers, of Austin Hearst, that he really saw his legacy less as the body of work itself, but what it would inspire into the future. And I think when you actually examine the clothing with that in mind, it really enriches the relationship as a viewer. It's not just fashion, it's not just an eccentric shape, it's intended as a kind of legacy that will have a life afterwards.
So one last question for Amanda before we open it up for a few questions from the audience. What are the lessons that can be learned today from James?
Rigor, don't give up. Probably if you are going to be a fashion designer, you've got to be more conciliatory and probably be nicer.
Well noted. And so are there audience questions? I'd like to open it up. Yes?
I've been a fan of this for a long time, and I have looked and I would love for one of you to say, oh, we are going to produce a book that opens these dresses and shows you the inside. That one in particular, it looks like it closes on the hip, maybe, and it's back here, and it looks like it's actually closed on the hip. I really want to see
No,
it.
the insides are fantastic. In your
So the Met's exhibition, Harold?
yeah.
We work with Diller Scofidio and Renfro, the architectural firm. And so we worked with architects, and our conservators, who have an intimate understanding of the construction of the garments, wanted to be able to present what really made them James, which is the structure, not how they looked, but really how they got to be the way they looked. And so we're going to begin to post them. I hesitated having them posted very early on because I wanted people to come to see the show. But there are these animations and diagrams and deconstructions of the pattern pieces and the way they work. In fact, there are some that are X-rays, but to see an X-ray is really to have the perception of knowledge. It doesn't really tell you very much because every gown that is a strapless has a certain kind of inner structure, and they're the same, whether it's James or Dior, John or Chanel.
Okay.
Chanel's might be lighter.
Yes, it's all about
I
the
think
unbelievable lightness.
Lightness. But if you go onto the Met website in about 2 weeks, you'll begin to see some of the analysis, how it's really, why is it James? And it's really how he's worked it. And, a crinoline is a crinoline. But there's one dress which I find such a marvel. It's his take on an 18th century pannier gown, with the wide hoops. And what he's done is he's had the hoops sag down around the knees of the wearer. And Scofidio has done is shown you with diagrams what is required for that dropped pannier to keep its form. And it's fascinating because it's an intersection of these different weights of boning, and it's shown in a diagram. So that is coming.
Great, so right here in front.
Thank you. I wanted to find out, I have two questions. Number one, what is his interaction with some of the European designers of his time, like Balenciaga, or maybe even Coco Chanel, or something, because I guess they were kind of contemporaries. And did he have that much interest, or was he just kind of...
He claimed that at one point, both Schiaparelli and Coco Chanel were clients, but he said Schiaparelli had to pay.
Does that mean Chanel got hers free?
She got hers free. She was the alpha client, With Balenciaga made this incredibly generous comment in a letter that the greatest American couturier is Charles James. In fact, he is the greatest dressmaker in the world, the only one who has elevated a craft into an art. I'm paraphrasing, but so that was Balenciaga talking about him. Dior acknowledged that it was a comment by James that inspired the new look, a reference to some sort of historical model and ideals of femininity in the body. So, they all knew each other. And when he showed in Paris, he did this one show in the late 40s where he presented not a collection, but a body of work that he had done in the 40s. Different houses lent their house mannequins, and Schiaparelli was there. And there's a picture that looks like Dior, but we haven't been able to confirm that it was Dior.
And my last question is, you said he had a family.
Yeah.
He had
2 children.
I'm sure they're still alive today.
Yeah, they're,
What are they? I mean, does he have, and are there grandchildren too?
yeah, there
So
are.
what are they all doing? Just real quick.
His son is an internet computer specialist. He does software. The daughter works in real estate in California. I don't know what the grandchildren do. The interesting thing about James, when I talk about, these people who bridged, upper class people who bridged the pre-war and post-World War I period, their attitudes about themselves are very different. They're not constrained by our kind of bourgeois, middle class, constraints. So James, who had been really very out and gay, more so than his friend Cecil Beaton, but very out and very gay through his life, falls in love with Nancy James and marries her. And the friends are stunned. But he says, but I fell in love with a woman, and I want a family. So even his primary sexuality, if he wanted to do something, he did it.
Thank you. All right there.
Mr. Koda, I'm just wondering, why do you think this exhibition is important here in Houston, and what does this add to this discussion?
Well, you know what's exciting about it is it's very rare. Because at the Costume Institute we see a lot of people who are fashion people. I mean, collectors of fashion, women of great style like Nan Kempner, or more eccentrically somebody like Iris Apfel. We've done shows about them. Jacqueline de Riebe is coming up, but it's very rare an instance where you see the larger aesthetic program of the person. There's something really critical about an eye of an individual, and many of the dresses that are there exist in variation in our collection. So it wasn't as if Dominique had the only one, it wasn't her. But there's still a lens through which everything gets filtered. I mean, a very constraining eye. And in the same way that you can walk through the galleries and see something that is, a Jasper Johns, and then go much earlier and you see a Magritte, and then there's this whole eclectic approach, but there's a kind of clarity to how they all relate. If you walk through the galleries, I think that's what makes this museum so wonderful. It's it's a couple, but it's a very defined aesthetic that just keeps reiterating itself. And so to have the clothes in the context of that, it really is marvelous. When I see what at the Met we call the March of Dimes dress, it's because of what he called it. It's the dress that has the velvet bodice, the satin overskirt, and the organza underskirt. I can see her in it. And it's something compelling about clothing that in the absence of the person, it still looks like the person. And that's what I think is so, to me, that sort of resonance between the collection, the house, and what she's wearing, the personal architecture, and the larger, now public collection, I think that's what's interesting for Houston.
Any more questions?
Oh, here's one.
Oh, yes. Did he comment on his own creativity?
He had a lot of comments on the lack of creativity of others.
Well, he did
Yeah,
speak quite a bit about the erotic, actually.
Right. Yeah, one of the things that we haven't touched on, and I don't know if Dominique and he ever had that conversation, but he really was, for someone who was gay, he was not a misogynist in the sense that his great patrons were all women. They were able to indulge his very erratic and capricious behavior, and they sustained him. I mean, through 3 decades, they were the ones. Even at the end of his life, it was very strong women who played a role in his life. And his relationship with he did a whole series of erotic drawings, and most of them are buttocks of men, but there were also a lot, but not in the same proportion, of images of nude women. And what he really seems to have cared about was the curvature at the small of the back and over the buttocks. And in the clothing, an expression of, I forget who, but, at the Wall Street Journal says I was being too coy, of labia. And
It's everywhere in his
it's
work,
everywhere.
yeah. Not only there, it's there
Right,
too.
right. And if you look at Dominique's neckline, there's labia.
Yeah.
I mean, once you look for it, you see it everywhere.
It's true.
And so I think you also see this in the chaise longue, and then the lip sofa. We sort of just generally refer to it as the lip sofa. But what was really remarkable in our own sort of thinking about those two pieces of furniture that he created was that, Dominique de Menil says that it was, she says it was derived from Man Ray's lips painting, the observatory time, the lovers. And what was remarkable was sort of thinking about those drawings that are in the exhibition and then seeing the form of the chaise longue. And it actually looks like a photograph where Man Ray places a woman
On the shelf.
yeah, and she's nude.
On a blanket.
Yeah, and you have that curvature, that small of the back, the buttocks.
What James said about the lip sofa, it's also been referred to as the butterfly sofa, was that it was based on ergonomics, that it allowed a woman to, or it allowed the occupant of the chaise, which breaks apart into two parts, to either be sitting upright comfortably or to be able to lounge comfortably, because you could pull them together or open them up. He was a great marketer. And so a few years later, he realized ergonomics doesn't really sell the idea. So then he said, well, what it really is the imprint left in concrete of a woman's buttocks.
Is that the little buttons?
What are those? I've never seen buttocks with those.
I have one more question.
Okay.
I wanted to know a little bit more about his millinery work. When did he start it, and how successful it was, and what kind of a worker did it look like? Pieces of sculpture, art, or
Well, there are two of the later pieces that Dominique
yeah.
has in the collection. They're very architectural. In fact, one of them looks sort of Philip Johnson, late Philip Johnson, the cloverleaf.
Very
looks like,
clean,
yeah.
very clean lined.
Yeah, but his earliest work began in the 1920s. His parents moved him to Chicago, and he worked for an energy business that was run by a family friend. And very quickly, he got kicked into the architecture department because he was just too loopy for the business guys. And in the architecture department, he was asked to leave because he began to model batik beach wraps and try to sell them to his cohorts. So when he left that place, he started a millinery company, studio, that he called Charles Boucheron, named after a friend because his father refused to be dishonored by the family name associated with this activity. And the hats are felts and straws that are very biomorphic. Starts with a large shape, but with a crown, pressed in, and he would cut them on your face. While you were wearing them on your head, so that there would be these flattering asymmetrical swoops to them. We have several of them in the exhibition. And then he would also do something that you see in the clothing when we're talking about vulvate or labiate forms. He would take the brim and he would just pull it up and tack it so that there would be this rippling. So they're beautiful hats. But by 1929, he became interested in doing dresses.
did he ever go back to hat millinery?
He kept in millinery really through the 50s, but they were really subordinated to the dresses.
And what else? Jewelry.
Yeah, he did jewelry. The jewelry that he actually produced was rather prosaic. They look sort of Edwardian. But in the last years of his life, after he had closed his business in 1958, in the 60s and 70s, he began working on other ideas for jewelry, and they're weird. They're beautiful, and so they're Elsa Peretti, Avant la Lettre. They're these biomorphic shapes done in plasticine, where he's put in mother of pearl, and he's you know, he doesn't leave well enough alone, so he's just
We actually have in the Menil collection, we have about 55 drawings of James. And some of these are actually, I think there's about 10 of which are drawings sketches towards these jewelry pieces. And he actually sort of writes poetry underneath. I wish I had it in front of me right now, but he likens one to a melting mountain. So again, almost like this exquisite corpse when he's thinking of the forms, and again calls to mind this sort of surreal thinking, that fantasy.
When you think about New York School abstract expressionists, but the decade before in the 40s, when they're still making they're bridging the gap into absolute abstraction. There's a surrealist moment where there are these weird amoebic forms and, you know, hairy eyeballs and things like that, and that's sort of like what the jewelry refers back to.
I will say that
sea creatures.
Yeah, just something that struck me is how beautiful his sketches are for his clothes. For the designs.
Robert Motherwell.
They're really so beautiful. I mean, even like adding in boot polish, you really feel there's something so like touching and sensuous about them, and the shapes and the inquiry of the shapes. He takes that through to the clothes. You actually
it's
feel
very
he
visceral.
never finished working on them. It had to be wrenched away from him, and that's like a painter.
Diana Vreeland said he'd rather rework a dress for a party than have the dress be at the party.
You sense that in the clothes.
I think we have time for one last question. So maybe in the back here, I saw that hand first. So please.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So, fashion poses a lot of ethical questions that are different than other types of art they pose. And it was mentioned during the lecture that John de Menil was perhaps reproached by his mother for indulging in fashion. For example, when they rose up from that economic hardship and he went to custom-made London shirts, did Charles James address that kind of ethical problem with fashion and art?
I'm not sure if I'd use the word ethical, but he really didn't care. You know, he was a real hedonist and sybarite. So some of the people that knew him, and you know, when he was really living hand to mouth, living because friends would purchase a drawing. They would never buy a lot. They would buy one. They'd pay $500 for a drawing. But because if they bought $2,500, it would be spent in one night. So I don't think, that's more like Jean de Menil buying the Lanvin shirts.
Right.
There was no sense of, people say he's a bad business person. It's just that he wasn't business-minded at all, except that he had some really great business ideas. It wasn't his temperament. He was an artist.
These are very voluptuous and sensual clothes. That's the point, I think. And Dominique de Menil was sort of came from an environment that was not that at all, but she was freed by her husband and became open to that.
And one last question for you, William.
Right.
Were you about to say something?
Yeah, I was
Yes,
going to say,
please,
so just
please.
because it was something you had referred to earlier about him as a mentor, I want to say that was an important part of the relationship with the de Menils as well, because education was something that was essential to them, and that's why so many of the works were given to the Brooklyn Museum, was not just to support Charles James, but to encourage people to learn, and that's why there's so many process-related items also, the patterns, the crinoline, the forms, and the drawings. You know, they really felt that people should learn from James's work. So there's a little altruism.
And what Amanda was saying about James sending books
Yeah.
To Dominique.
To Dominique. That's fascinating. I want to know all where's the library? I mean, because that tells a whole story of their relationship, really, because the message is in the book.
Right, and he, when I interviewed Elizabeth de Cuevas, she said he gave her books as well, and so he had this penchant for sharing books, and oftentimes he would come storming in, reading passages from books, cackling. So maybe William, we might finish with a comment from you. Maybe could you just speak to, as sort of a closing remark, how you see James as influencing, when we talk about mentoring, obviously you said that they were interested in mentoring, an up-and-coming generation of designers, passing on education that way, but it seems like he was an education for them as well. Can you close with a remark about that?
Sure. I wish I had the quote in front of me, but what Dominique learned from him was always question and always try the difficult, always make an effort. She talked about the sort of heroic energy that James brought to everything, and that was what she learned from him.
Thank you. All right, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
I do remember.